My rich parents disowned me for marrying a nobody. Then they saw his bank account. Sometimes, I wonder if I was ever more than an investment to my parents. To them, love came with conditions. Respect had a price tag. And the moment I stepped out of line, out of their carefully planned future for me, everything they gave was snatched away. Tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know. Drop your country or city in the comments. I grew up in a world where wealth meant everything. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, came from old money. Our family name carried weight, and appearances mattered more than anything else. I was their only daughter, their perfect little project. From the moment I could walk, they molded me into the ideal heiress. Flawless manners, prestigious schools, expensive hobbies. Every part of my life was curated to match their expectations, and for the longest time, I played my role perfectly. I dated the right men, attended the right parties, and wore the right designer labels. But then I met Daniel. And suddenly, none of it mattered. I remember the exact moment I knew he was different. It was at a charity event, one of those extravagant galas my mother loved throwing. I had stepped outside for some air, exhausted from pretending to enjoy conversations with men my parents approved of. That's when I saw him. He wasn't dressed like the other guests. No overpriced tux, no polished arrogance. Just a simple suit and a quiet confidence that made him stand out more than anyone else in the room. "You don't look like you want to be here," he said, his voice warm and teasing. I laughed. "That obvious?" He smiled. "Yeah, I'm Daniel, by the way. I'm here on behalf of the company I work for. They sent me to represent them, but honestly, I'd rather be anywhere else." I should have walked away. My mother always warned me about men who weren't on our level. But something about him made me stay. We talked all night. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not as Richard and Evelyn's daughter, not as an heiress, but as myself. And that terrified me. My parents noticed the change immediately. I started skipping events, making excuses to see Daniel instead. He showed me a world outside of wealth and reputation, a world where love wasn't calculated, where people worked hard and earned their success instead of inheriting it. But when my parents finally met him, their disappointment was palpable. They did their research, of course. They always did. "He's a nobody!" my mother scoffed. "Middle class, no connections, no future." My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. "You'll get over this phase, Andrea." But it wasn't a phase. And when I refused to stop seeing him, they made their stance very clear. "You marry that man," my mother said coldly, "and you're out of this family." I didn't even hesitate. "Then I guess I'm out." I packed my bags that night. I had grown up in a mansion, but it had never felt like home. Not really. Daniel met me at the train station. He didn't ask if I was sure. He just took my hand, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "We'll be okay." And for the first time, I believed it. I left behind the luxury, the wealth, the security, but I wasn't scared. I was finally free. Little did I know, my parents had no idea who they had just turned their backs on, because Daniel was far more than just some nobody. And soon, they would find out exactly what they had lost. Daniel worked in tech. He was brilliant, so much smarter than my parents ever gave him credit for. He had dreams bigger than any fortune my family had. I, on the other hand, had never worked a day in my life. But I wasn't about to sit around waiting for someone to rescue me. So, I got a job at a small cafe. Of all places. It was humbling, to say the least. I went from being served at high-end restaurants to cleaning tables and taking orders from impatient customers. I made mistakes, spilled coffee, mixed up orders. But for the first time, I was earning something for myself. And that meant everything. My parents? They pretended I didn't exist. I wasn't surprised. No calls, no messages, not even a passive-aggressive email from my mother. They had wiped me from their lives like I was a failed business deal. But I knew them. I knew they were waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to beg to come back, waiting to say, "I told you so." But they would be waiting forever, because Daniel and I were building something real. Months passed. Daniel spent every spare moment working on a project, one he refused to tell me about. He would stay up late, lost in lines of code, completely in his element. "This is going to change everything," he told me once, his eyes alight with excitement. I believed him, because he always made the impossible feel possible. Then, one day, everything changed. I was at work when a familiar face walked through the cafe doors. My mother. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the counter, where I stood frozen, gripping a coffee pot so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a second, I thought maybe she was here to see me. That maybe, just maybe, she missed me. But then she opened her mouth. "I'll have a latte. Skim milk." Like I was just some stranger. Like I wasn't her daughter. Something inside me cracked. I made the latte. I handed it to her without a word. She took one sip, wrinkled her nose, and pushed it back toward me. "This is cold." I took the cup, dumped it, and made another. My hands were shaking, but I kept my face blank. She sipped again. This time she didn't complain. Instead, she looked me up and down, taking in my apron, my tired eyes, the life I had chosen. "You look awful," she said finally, her voice dripping with disapproval. I bit my tongue. Then, before I could stop myself, I said, "You look the same." Her eyes narrowed. For a second, I thought she would slap me right there in the middle of the cafe. But instead, she just smirked. "You can come home anytime, Andrea," she said. "All you have to do is leave him." I should have been angry, but all I felt was pity. She didn't understand. She never would. So I just smiled. "I am home." She sighed, shaking her head like I was some lost cause. Then she turned and walked out. And just like that, she was gone again. That night, I told Daniel what happened. He listened, his jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around my hand. "She doesn't deserve you," he said softly. I squeezed his hand. "I know." And for the first time, I really, truly meant it. Time passed. Seasons changed. Then, one evening, Daniel came home, grinning from ear to ear. "I did it," he said, breathless. I blinked. "Did what?" He sat beside me, pulling out his laptop. "I sold it." "Sold what?" "My project." His voice shook with excitement. "Andrea, we're millionaires." I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up. "What?" He laughed, pulling me into his arms. "I built something good. And they paid a lot for it." I pulled back, searching his face for any sign that he was joking. But he wasn't. He had done it. We had done it. We weren't just surviving anymore. We had won. Word spread fast. One moment, we were invisible. The next, we were on magazine covers, tech articles, news interviews. And of course, my parents noticed. It started with a phone call. One I didn't answer. Then an email. Then another. Then finally a visit. They showed up at our new home. No longer a tiny apartment, but a beautiful house overlooking the city. My mother smiled like nothing had happened. My father held out his hand like we were business partners. "It's good to see you, sweetheart," my mother said smoothly. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "No, it's not." A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but she kept smiling. "We were just talking about how much we miss you," she continued. "It's been too long." I almost laughed. Too long? They had erased me the moment I walked away. And now that I had something they valued, they wanted me back? Daniel appeared behind me, wrapping an arm around my waist. My father cleared his throat. "Daniel, I hear you've done well for yourself." Daniel just smiled. "Yeah, funny how life works out." Silence stretched between us. Then my mother reached out, touching my arm lightly. "We should have dinner," she said. "As a family." Family. The word left a bitter taste in my mouth. I glanced at Daniel and he gave me a look that said, "Your choice." So I smiled sweetly and said, "No, thanks." My mother's face froze. I took Daniel's hand and gently shut the door in their faces. They had their chance, and they threw it away. I didn't need their love anymore, because I had real love, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. I used to think my parents had all the power, that no matter what I did, they controlled the narrative, that they could cut me off and erase me, and I would just disappear into nothing. But now they were the ones on the outside, and for the first time in my life, I had the power to say no. After I closed the door in their faces, I half expected them to try again, to knock, to call my name, to refuse to accept that I had made my choice. But they didn't. They just stood there for a moment, silent, before finally turning and walking away. I watched them leave through the window, their figures shrinking into the night, and something inside me twisted. Not guilt, not regret, just finality. It was over, or at least I thought it was. The next day, I woke up to a flood of messages, friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them suddenly remembered I existed. "Andrea, it's been forever. How have you been? Wow, I saw the news. So proud of you. Hey, let's catch up soon. I'd love to hear about everything." Everything? Or just the part where I went from poor and foolish to rich and successful? It was all so transparent. They didn't care about me. They cared about my money. But the biggest surprise? My mother. For years, she had been the queen of silent treatment. If I upset her, she simply acted like I wasn't there. But now? Now she was calling, texting, even leaving voicemails, something she never did. "Andrea, I understand you're upset, but let's be reasonable. You should have told us about Daniel's business. We could have helped. You're still our daughter. We just want what's best for you." I almost laughed. Help? When I was struggling, they ignored me. When Daniel was building his dream, they mocked him. But now that he had made it, now they wanted to be involved. It was pathetic. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond. I just let them talk to the silence. A week passed before my mother tried a new approach. Manipulation. It started with a message that was almost sweet. "We should have handled things differently, Andrea. We made mistakes. Let's fix them." But when I didn't respond, the mask slipped. "You're being selfish. Do you know how embarrassing this has been for us?" And finally, "You wouldn't have anything without us." There it was, the truth they couldn't hide. They still thought they owned me. That no matter what I did, no matter how successful I became, I was still their creation, still theirs to control. I didn't answer. Instead, I took Daniel's hand, kissed him, and said, "Let's go on a trip." No hesitation, no second thoughts. We packed our bags that night, We had spent so long working, fighting, proving ourselves. Now it was time to live. We traveled, not just to luxurious places, but to the places that meant something to us. The small cafe where we had our first real conversation. The beach town he always dreamed of visiting as a kid. The little bookstore I had loved as a teenager, but never had time to go back to. We weren't spending money to show off. We were spending it to make memories. And that was worth more than anything my parents ever bought me. Meanwhile, my mother was growing desperate. She started reaching out to Daniel. "I know Andrea is being stubborn, but you seem like a reasonable man. We can put the past behind us, Daniel. Let's talk." He read the messages and shook his head. "I don't think they realize who they're dealing with," he muttered. I smiled. Let them keep guessing. Because that's what this was now. A game to them. And I wasn't playing anymore. Then, one evening, I got a message that caught me off guard. My father. He rarely spoke, even when I lived under his roof. My mother was the one who controlled the conversations, the relationships, the emotions. But now, he had something to say. "Andrea, let's meet." Just that. No explanation, no fake pleasantries. For some reason, that made me pause. Not because I trusted him, but because I was curious. I met him at a private club, the kind of place he always used to take business associates. He was already seated, a drink in front of him, his posture stiff. When I sat down, he didn't waste time. "Your mother is struggling with this?" I raised an eyebrow. Struggling with what? The fact that I'm happy? Or the fact that I don't need her? His jaw tightened. "She's your mother, Andrea." I laughed. "She was my warden. There's a difference." He exhaled slowly, like he was trying to be patient. "This isn't how things were supposed to go," he said. So that was it. It wasn't about love. It was about control. They had mapped out my future. They had expected me to obey. But I had ruined their perfect plan. I stood. "I don't know what you were hoping for," I said, "but this conversation is over." He watched me, his expression unreadable. Then he said the one thing that could still hurt me. "You were never meant to be on your own, Andrea." I froze. Because those words, they were what I had feared my whole life. That without my family's money, I was nothing. That I wasn't strong enough to stand on my own. But now I knew the truth. I wasn't on my own. I had Daniel. I had a life I built with my own hands, and I would never let them take that from me. I met my father's gaze. "I was always stronger than you thought." Then I turned and walked away. For good. I thought that was the end of it. That after walking away from my father, they would finally accept it. That they would stop trying to pull me back into their world. But I was wrong. Because for people like my parents, losing control wasn't an option. And when manipulation didn't work, they got desperate. Daniel and I had just returned from a weekend getaway when I got the call. Unknown number. I wouldn't have answered, but something told me to. The moment I did, my mother's voice filled my ear. "Andrea." No fake warmth. No sweet pretense. Just my name, cold and sharp. "What do you want?" I asked, already exhausted. "We need to talk. We've done enough talking." She sighed like I was the one being difficult. "This isn't just about you, Andrea. Your father and I." I laughed. "Oh, don't do that. Don't act like you suddenly care about us. This is about your pride, isn't it?" Silence. And then, "We're in trouble." I almost didn't believe it. My parents? The almighty, untouchable Richard and Evelyn Crawford? In trouble? Number, it had to be a lie. A ploy. Another way to manipulate me into coming back. Whatever it is, it's not my problem, I said. Her voice wavered. We're going to lose everything, Andrea. And that was the moment I knew it was real. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. They had always lived on the edge, overspending, flaunting their wealth, taking risks. It had finally caught up to them. And now, they were drowning. And they expected me to save them. For a brief moment, the old me resurfaced. The daughter who had spent years craving their approval. The girl who had always cleaned up their messes, even when they never thanked her. But then, I remembered. They didn't raise me. They owned me. Or at least, they thought they did. I need to go, I told Daniel later that night. He frowned. Go where? My parents' house. He stiffened. Andrea. I held up a hand. I'm not going to help them. I need to see it. See the empire they built collapsing. See them stripped of the power they had used to control me. See, for myself, that they were finally paying the price. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Not the warm silence of a home, but the heavy silence of something decaying. My mother sat in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. My father stood by the window, staring out like he was trying to escape reality. They looked smaller, weaker, like they had aged 10 years in the past few months. Look who finally decided to visit, my mother said, voice bitter. I ignored her and turned to my father. Is it true? I asked. His jaw tightened. Yes. And just like that, it was real. The house, going on the market, the luxury cars, already sold, the business, on the verge of bankruptcy, everything they had used to define themselves, gone. My mother exhaled sharply. Andrea, you could help us. Just a little. I scoffed. You mean the way you helped me when I needed you? Her eyes flashed with anger. That's not the same. No? I crossed my arms. Tell me how. She faltered. I shook my head. You only want me now? Because you have nothing. I turned to my father. And you? You have nothing to say? He didn't meet my eyes, because he knew I was right. Please, Andrea. The words startled me. My mother never begged. But now, with her world crumbling, she was grasping for anything. For me. And for a split second, I felt sorry for her. But then I remembered. The years of neglect, the insults, the way she discarded me like I was worthless. And I realized something. They weren't sorry. They weren't ashamed. They were just desperate. And I wasn't their lifeline. Not anymore. I stepped back. I'm sorry you're going through this, I said. And I meant it. Because no matter how much they hurt me, I never wished this on them. But that didn't mean I owed them anything. I looked my mother in the eye. But you made your choices. And now, you have to live with them. Her face twisted with rage. You ungrateful little... I smiled. Goodbye, Mom. And I walked out. For the last time, I sat in my car, my hands shaking. Not with fear, not with guilt, but with relief. Because for the first time in my life, I had nothing left to prove to them. And it felt good. When I got home, Daniel was waiting. I barely made it inside before he pulled me into his arms. Are you okay? He asked. I let out a breath. Yeah, I think I am. He kissed my forehead. Good. Because we have a life to live. And it doesn't include them. And he was right. I had spent so long trying to earn their love. But love wasn't something you had to earn. It was something freely given. And I had it. With Daniel. With the family we would build together. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. And for the first time, I was truly, finally free. I thought walking away would be the end of it. That once I closed that door, they would disappear from my life forever. But people like my parents, they don't just give up. Especially when they're desperate. And I was about to learn just how far they would go to get what they wanted. It started with the calls. At first, I ignored them, blocked one number, then another, but they kept coming. Then the emails, then messages from distant relatives, people who had never cared about me before, suddenly pleading with me to be reasonable. My mother had made sure everyone knew her version of the story. And in her version, I was the cruel, selfish daughter who abandoned her family in their time of need. Not the child they had disowned. Not the girl they had thrown away when she refused to obey. Number just the villain in her carefully constructed tale. One afternoon, I opened my inbox to see an email from an old family friend. It was short. I don't know what's true, but you don't owe them anything. Take care of yourself. And that was the moment I realized, not everyone believed their lies. Some people saw the truth. And even if they didn't say it out loud, they knew. And that was enough. Then one night, Daniel and I were having dinner when the doorbell rang. I frowned. We weren't expecting anyone. Daniel stood. I'll get it. I heard the door open, then, where is she? I froze. My mother. Daniel didn't let her in, but I heard her voice, sharp and desperate. You can't keep her from me. I'm not keeping her from you, Daniel said, calm but firm. She doesn't want to see you. A pause. Then her voice softened. Daniel, I know you're a reasonable man. You understand family obligations. Obligations? Daniel echoed. You mean the way you were obligated to love and support your daughter? Silence. I walked to the door and stepped beside him. My mother's face twisted in anger the second she saw me. There you are, she snapped. Are you really going to let him keep you away from us? I sighed. No one is keeping me from anything, Mom. I'm choosing to stay away. Her lips pressed into a thin line. After everything we've done for you? I laughed. Actually laughed. What exactly have you done for me? I asked. She scoffed. We raised you. No, I said, voice steady. You controlled me. You used me. And when I didn't do what you wanted, you threw me away. She flinched, but I wasn't done. And now that you've lost everything, suddenly I'm important again? Suddenly I matter? I shook my head. You don't want a daughter, Mom. You want a safety net. A lifeline. Her eyes flashed. You're being ridiculous. No, I said. I'm finally seeing the truth. She exhaled sharply. Fine, be selfish, but one day you'll regret this. I held her gaze. No, Mom, I won't. Then I shut the door. I expected to feel sad, guilty, maybe even conflicted, but all I felt was relief. Daniel wrapped an arm around me. Are you okay? I nodded. Yeah, I really think I am. Because for the first time, I had chosen myself, and I wasn't looking back. A few weeks passed. The calls stopped. The emails slowed. My parents faded into the background, too caught up in their own downfall to chase me anymore. And just like that, I was free. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights. He looked at me, a small smile on his lips. "You know," he said, "I'm proud of you." I blinked. For what? For standing up for yourself. For letting go. I exhaled. It took me long enough. He squeezed my hand. "Healing isn't a race, Andrea." I smiled. For so long, I had let my parents define my worth, let them dictate my choices. But not anymore. I wasn't the daughter they wanted, but I was exactly who I was meant to be. And that was enough. I used to think closure meant getting an apology. That one day, my parents would realize how much they had hurt me. That they would call, tell me they were sorry, and beg for my forgiveness. But I learned something important. Closure isn't about getting answers. It's about deciding the past doesn't control you anymore. And I was finally ready to let go. A few months passed, and life felt lighter. Daniel and I built a home filled with love, respect, and laughter, things I had never known growing up. I focused on my career, my dreams, my happiness. And for the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for my parents' approval. I didn't need it. One evening, Daniel and I were at a charity gala. It was a cause he deeply cared about, helping young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds start their own businesses. I was standing by the bar when I heard a familiar voice. Cold, sharp, unmistakable. "Andrea." I turned, and there they were, my parents. They looked different. My mother's designer clothes couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. My father, once so proud and commanding, seemed smaller, like he had lost something he couldn't get back. I didn't know why they were there. Maybe they had been invited. Maybe they had crashed the event, hoping to find someone to invest in whatever scheme they had left. But I didn't care. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. My mother's eyes flickered over me, like she was searching for weakness. She wouldn't find any. "I see you're still playing house with your little husband," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I smiled. "And I see you're still pretending to be important." Her face twisted in anger, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. "I know why you're here," I said. "You're looking for someone to save you." My father's jaw tightened. "That's not true." I laughed. "It always is with you." I tilted my head. "Tell me, how does it feel? To lose everything you thought made you powerful?" My mother scoffed. "You think you're better than us now?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "I think I'm free." Daniel appeared beside me, placing a hand on the small of my back. A silent show of support, of love. My mother's eyes darkened at the sight of us together, standing united. "It should have been you supporting us," she said, her voice tight with resentment. I smiled, calm and unbothered. "Funny, I used to think the same thing about you." She opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "I don't owe you anything." My voice was steady, final. And for the first time, I saw something in her eyes I never had before. Fear. Because she knew she had truly lost me, and there was nothing she could do to get me back. I took Daniel's hand and turned to leave. But then, my father spoke. Quiet. Strained. "Andrea." I looked over my shoulder. He swallowed hard. "You really won't help us?" There was something in his voice. Something I had waited my whole life to hear. Not love, not regret, but acknowledgement. That I was no longer their pawn. That I had won. I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No." Then I walked away. As we stepped outside, Daniel turned to me. "You okay?" I let out a breath and smiled. "Yeah." Because for the first time in my life, I was finally free. People say blood is thicker than water, that family is forever. But the truth is, family isn't about blood. It's about love, respect, choice. And sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is walk away. I don't know what happened to my parents after that night. And for the first time, I don't care. Because my life, it's mine now. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. A year passed. Daniel and I continued building our life together. We launched a foundation to help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue education in technology. We wanted to give others the chance to write their own stories, just like we had. One morning, I was reading the newspaper when I saw it. A small article, tucked away in the business section. My parents had lost everything. Their home, their assets, their reputation. They were starting over, in a modest apartment in a different city. For a moment, I felt a twinge of something. Not guilt, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. They had reaped what they had sown. And now they were learning to live with the consequences. Just like I had learned to live without them. I closed the newspaper and looked around our home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the space we had created together. Photos of our travels lined the walls. Books we loved filled the shelves. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And it was built on something my parents never understood: unconditional love. Daniel walked in, coffee in hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing my expression. I smiled. "Just how far we've come." He sat beside me, taking my hand. "Any regrets?" I thought about it. About the life I left behind, the wealth, the privilege, the emptiness, and I shook my head. Not a single one. Later that week, a letter arrived. No return address, just my name, written in a handwriting I recognized immediately. My mother's. I held it, unsure if I wanted to open it, to let her back into my life, even in this small way. Daniel watched me, concern in his eyes. "You don't have to read it," he said softly. But I did. Not because I owed her anything, but because I was strong enough now to hear whatever she had to say without letting it break me. The letter was short. No apology. No admission of wrongdoing. Just a simple acknowledgement of reality. "We made mistakes. We lost you. And now we've lost everything else, too. I hope you're happy, Andrea. I really do." It wasn't what I had hoped for all those years. It wasn't the heartfelt apology I once dreamed of. But it was something. A small crack in the armor of a woman who had spent a lifetime believing she was always right. I folded the letter and put it away. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. We had both made our choices. And now, we were living with them. Months later, Daniel and I found out we were expecting our first child. As I stood in our bathroom, staring at the positive test, a wave of emotions washed over me. Joy, excitement, and a flicker of fear. What kind of parent would I be? Would I repeat my parents' mistakes? Would I know how to give this child the love I never had? Daniel held me that night as I voiced these fears. "You know what makes you different from them?" he asked. I looked up at him, waiting. "You're asking these questions. You care. You want to do better. And that's why you will." And he was right. I didn't have a blueprint for good parenting, but I had a clear picture of what not to do. And that was a start. When our daughter was born, we named her Lily. Not after any family member. Not to carry on a legacy, but because she was something new. Something untouched by the past. Our fresh start. As I held her in my arms, I made a silent promise. She would never question her worth, never feel like she had to earn my love, never wonder if she was enough. Because she was, just by existing, just by being herself. And that was the greatest lesson my parents ever taught me, by showing me exactly what love shouldn't be. Family isn't about shared blood, it's about shared respect. And if someone, even family, only sees you as a tool for their own benefit, you don't owe them a place in your life. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away. And sometimes, walking away is how you finally find your way home. Thank you for watching. My rich parents disowned me for marrying a nobody, then they saw his bank account. I hope my story inspired you. If you've ever had to choose between toxic family relationships and your own happiness, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Have you experienced something similar? Or do you think family should always come first, no matter what? Let me know your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, check out my other videos right here. I share new content every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Remember, family isn't about shared blood, it's about shared respect. Sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born into. See you in the next video!